Charlotte Hayes slowly looked at the invoice and laughed out loud in the middle of a crowded garage. Just to inspect her $5 million hypercar, the man in the grease-stained jacket standing before her had asked for $899. The managers behind her laughed along with her. But Jackson Reed did not argue. He simply closed his toolbox and calmly said she did not need to pay him. He also would not touch the car again. Charlotte thought she had just won the bargain. 2 days later, the $5 million car was completely motionless. Charlotte Hayes had built her name on confidence long before she inherited the company that made it famous. As the chief executive of Hayes Automotive, she carried herself like someone who had never once been told no and meant it. She wore tailored blazers the color of dark steel, kept her hair pulled back with surgical precision, and walked through every room as though the floor itself had been designed to hold her weight and nothing more. On the morning of the unveiling, photographers and engineers and junior executives filled the private showroom floor, all of them waiting for her to unveil the company's crown jewel. The car at the center of the room was not simply a vehicle. It was a statement, a $5 million hypercar built with a hand-assembled engine, carbon fiber body panels imported from 3 different countries, and a top speed that had taken 2 years of wind tunnel testing to perfect. Hayes Automotive had staked its entire upcoming international showcase on this single machine, and Charlotte had personally approved every detail down to the stitching on the leather seats. The press had already started calling it the future of performance engineering, and Charlotte intended to make sure that headline stuck. Then, 3 days before the unveiling was meant to go public, the engine refused to start. It happened without warning during a routine diagnostic run. The dashboard lit up with cascading error codes that meant nothing to the technicians staring at the screen, and within minutes the entire electrical system locked itself into a defensive shutdown that no one in the building knew how to override. Adrian Cole, the company's chief technical officer, rushed down personally to oversee the situation, certain that his team could resolve it within the hour. The hour passed. Then another. Then an entire day disappeared into a blur of disconnected battery packs, swapped sensors, and increasingly tense phone calls. The car sat motionless in a secured storage bay, its hood propped open like a patient mid-surgery, surrounded by men and women in clean uniforms who had no idea what they were looking at. Charlotte stood at the edge of the room watching them work, arms crossed, jaw tight, refusing to let her expression slip into the panic she actually felt building beneath her composure. She had press flights booked. She had international dealers expecting a flawless debut. She had board members who had already begun asking pointed questions about delays, and she did not have a single honest answer for any of them. By the second day, Adrian's confidence had started to crack at the edges, though he refused to admit it out loud. His team had replaced parts that were not broken, run diagnostics that returned conflicting results, and quietly begun to suspect that the problem lived somewhere deeper than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Charlotte called an emergency meeting that evening, slamming her tablet onto the conference table hard enough to make the younger engineers flinch. She told them in no uncertain terms that the car needed to be running before the showcase and that she did not care how it happened or who it required. It was Adrian, finally cornered with no remaining excuses, who mentioned the name almost reluctantly. There was a man, he said, who ran a small independent garage outside the city limits. Difficult, unconventional. Not someone Adrian particularly wanted to call. But if anyone outside their own walls could look at a problem this strange and actually understand it, it would be him. Charlotte did not recognize the name, and in that moment she did not care who the man was. She only wanted her car running again, and she wanted it running soon. Jackson Reed's garage sat at the edge of a quiet industrial road, a low building with peeling paint and a gravel lot that rarely held more than 2 cars at once. There was no sign out front advertising his name, no glossy branding, no waiting room with magazines and coffee machines. Just a man, a set of tools that had clearly seen decades of use, and a reputation that traveled exclusively by word of mouth among people who understood exactly what they were looking at when they watched him work. He arrived at Hayes Automotive's facility in a faded work jacket with grease stains permanently pressed into the fabric, carrying a single metal toolbox that looked older than some of the engineers standing nearby. Adrian met him at the entrance with a tight, apologetic smile, the kind reserved for situations where pride had already been swallowed once and would likely need to be swallowed again. Jackson said little. He simply nodded, asked where the vehicle was located, and followed Adrian through the building without a single question about timelines or expectations. Charlotte was waiting near the storage bay when he arrived, flanked by two of her senior managers, and the first thing she noticed was how unremarkable he looked. No designer watch, no confident swagger, no air of someone who expected to be taken seriously in a room full of polished executives. She exchanged a quick, knowing glance with one of the managers beside her, the kind of glance that needed no words to communicate exactly what she was thinking. Jackson walked a slow circle around the car before he ever touched it. He crouched beside the front wheel well, listened to something only he seemed to hear, and ran his fingers along a section of wiring near the engine bay with the careful attention of someone reading Braille. He spent nearly 40 minutes simply observing before he finally opened his toolbox, and in that time he asked exactly 3 questions, each one sharper and more specific than anything the in-house engineering team had asked in 2 full days. When he finally straightened up, he told Charlotte that the issue was not simple, and that whatever was causing the shutdown lived somewhere deeper than a faulty sensor or a loose connection. He explained that a proper diagnostic, one that would actually identify the root cause rather than guessing at symptoms, would require specialized equipment and several hours of focused work. The fee for that diagnostic, he said plainly, was $899. The silence lasted only a second before Charlotte laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the concrete walls of the storage bay. She asked him, only half joking, if he understood what kind of car was sitting in front of him. The managers behind her chuckled along, one of them muttering something about garage rates for a $5 million machine, and the sound of their amusement filled the space where Jackson's quiet explanation had just been. Jackson did not raise his voice. He did not defend the number or attempt to justify it further. He simply looked at Charlotte for a long moment, the kind of look that held more patience than offense, and waited for the laughter to settle into silence before he said anything else at all. Charlotte folded her arms and waited, expecting an apology or at least an attempt to lower the price. Instead, Jackson explained calmly and without a trace of defensiveness that the fee he had quoted was not a repair cost at all. It was a specialized diagnostic charge, the kind reserved for problems that required custom equipment most general garages did not own and most manufacturers refused to admit they needed. He told her that fixing the actual problem once identified would likely cost far more, and that the number she found so laughable was simply the price of finding the truth. Charlotte's smile thinned. She told him in the clipped tone she usually reserved for board members who had disappointed her that she would not be paying for guesswork dressed up as expertise. She said it loudly enough for the room to hear, loudly enough that Adrian visibly stiffened beside her, and loudly enough that the 2 managers behind her exchanged another satisfied glance, certain their CEO had just put an overconfident mechanic back in his place. Jackson listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, he simply nodded once, closed the latch on his toolbox, and lifted it from the ground with the same unhurried calm he had carried since the moment he walked through the door. There was no anger in his movements, no wounded pride. Just the quiet efficiency of a man who had clearly been underestimated before and had long since stopped finding it surprising. He turned toward the exit, then paused just long enough to look back at the car, then at Charlotte, then at the small crowd of managers still smirking near the storage bay entrance. His voice, when it came, was even and unremarkable, almost gentle in its delivery, which made what he said land with far more weight than if he had shouted it. Then the car will never move again. The laughter that followed was instant and loud, the kind of laughter that fills a room when people believe they have just witnessed someone embarrass themselves on the way out the door. One of the managers actually clapped once, sarcastically, as though applauding a poor performance. Charlotte allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, certain she had just watched an overpriced mechanic retreat from a fight he never should have started in the first place. Adrian laughed loudest of all, relieved that the awkward, unconventional outsider he had reluctantly recommended was finally leaving the building, taking his strange demands and his stranger confidence with him. Nobody in that storage bay, least of all Charlotte, gave Jackson's parting words a second thought as he walked out into the gravel lot, climbed into his worn pickup truck, and drove away without once looking back toward the building. What none of them understood yet, standing there congratulating themselves over a victory that had cost them nothing but a moment of cheap satisfaction, was that Jackson Reed had never once exaggerated a diagnosis in his entire career, and he had absolutely no intention of starting now. The morning after Jackson left, Adrian assembled his entire technical division and announced, with more confidence than the situation deserved, that they would solve the problem internally and prove that an outside diagnostic had never been necessary in the first place. Charlotte approved overtime for the whole team, certain that throwing enough skilled hands at the car would resolve whatever minor glitch was hiding inside its wiring. Neither of them yet understood the size of the mistake they had just made. The team began by replacing the battery management module, convinced the cascading errors pointed to a power distribution failure. The car remained silent. They moved on to the sensor array near the engine bay, swapping out 3 separate units that had shown irregular readings during testing, certain that one of them had to be the culprit. Still nothing. Days passed in a blur of disassembled panels and discarded parts, each replacement costing tens of thousands of dollars in specialized components that Hayes Automotive had to source on emergency timelines from suppliers across multiple countries. By the 4th day, the diagnostic errors had not improved, they had multiplied. What had once been a single warning code blinking on the dashboard had grown into a cascade of conflicting signals, some of them contradicting each other entirely, as though the system itself no longer trusted its own readings. One senior engineer admitted privately to a colleague that he suspected they had made things worse through sheer trial and error, though neither of them dared say it within earshot of Adrian. The total repair expenditure had climbed past $400,000, an amount that triggered automatic review from the finance department and several uncomfortable questions from board members who had been kept in the dark about the severity of the situation. Charlotte found herself fielding calls she did not want to take, offering vague reassurances about timelines she no longer believed in, all while the international showcase crept closer with every passing hour. The car, despite every part replaced and every diagnostic run, would not start. Not a flicker. Not a single functioning system beyond the dashboard lights that continued their meaningless, mocking cascade of errors. The engine bay had been opened and closed so many times that grease-stained fingerprints covered nearly every surface, evidence of effort without progress, of expertise without understanding. Word began leaking outside the company walls, as it always does when enough engineers whisper to enough friends in the industry. A small automotive blog ran a short speculative piece questioning why the celebrated unveiling had been quietly postponed without explanation. It was a minor mention, buried beneath bigger headlines, but Charlotte read it 3 times anyway, feeling something cold settle into her stomach that she did not entirely recognize as fear, though it certainly resembled it. By the end of the week, with the showcase now dangerously close and the car no closer to running than it had been on the very first day, Charlotte sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a closed laptop, replaying the sound of her own laughter from 1 week earlier, and finding it considerably less satisfying with each passing replay. While Hayes Automotive descended further into quiet chaos, Jackson spent his evenings exactly as he always did, working alone in his garage under a single hanging light, the radio tuned low to an old jazz station that nobody else seemed to listen to anymore. He had not mentioned the encounter at the showroom to anyone, had not gloated, had not even brought it up when an old friend stopped by unannounced one evening carrying a bag of takeout and a long overdue apology for losing touch. The friend's name was Walter Briggs, a retired propulsion engineer who had spent the better part of 3 decades designing performance systems before retiring quietly to a small house outside the city. Walter had heard, through the kind of industry grapevine that never quite disappears no matter how long someone has been retired, that Hayes Automotive's flagship hypercar had developed a mysterious fault that nobody internally could explain. He mentioned it almost casually while unpacking containers of food onto Jackson's workbench, and Jackson's silence in response told Walter everything he needed to know. It was Walter who finally said the thing Jackson himself never bothered to mention to anyone. The thing that explained exactly why Jackson had quoted such a specific, deliberate diagnostic fee in the first place. Years earlier, long before Hayes Automotive became a household name in performance engineering, Jackson had worked as part of the original prototype team that developed the very engine platform their celebrated hypercar was built upon. He had not simply worked on it. He had helped design core elements of the cooling and sensor architecture that still existed, largely unchanged, deep inside the current model. Adrian Cole had known this fact for years, buried in old personnel records from a previous division merger that most current employees had never bothered to read. When Jackson's name first came up as a possible solution to the crisis, Adrian had recognized it immediately, and had said nothing to Charlotte about the history connecting Jackson to the very engine they could not understand. It was easier, Adrian had decided in that moment, to let Charlotte underestimate an unfamiliar outsider than to admit that the most qualified person for the job had once been a colleague Adrian quietly resented and eventually pushed out of the company entirely. The reasons were not complicated, even if Adrian preferred not to examine them too closely. Jackson's technical instincts had always been sharper than his own, his diagnostic skill more intuitive, his reputation among engineers who actually understood propulsion systems considerably more respected than Adrian's carefully managed corporate image. Watching Jackson walk away from the showroom in humiliation had felt, to Adrian, like a small and necessary correction to an old imbalance that had bothered him for years. Jackson, for his part, harbored no illusions about why Adrian had brought him in, only to let him be mocked without defense. He had recognized Adrian's face the moment he walked through the door, had understood within seconds exactly what kind of professional courtesy he could expect from a man who once celebrated his exit from the company with a small private toast among colleagues who thought no one was listening. None of it surprised him. None of it changed what he already knew about the engine sitting motionless inside that storage bay, waiting for someone willing to actually listen to what it was trying to say. With the showcase now less than a week away and her own engineering team thoroughly defeated, Charlotte authorized an emergency budget to bring in outside specialists, the kind of consultants whose names appeared in trade publications and whose hourly rates reflected reputations built over entire careers. Within 2 days, a team flew in from Germany, followed shortly by a separate consultant from Italy who had once worked on motorsport propulsion systems for a championship-winning racing team. The German team arrived with their own diagnostic equipment, confident and methodical, running tests that took nearly 12 hours to complete. Their conclusion, delivered with polished professionalism, was that the issue likely originated in a firmware conflict between two separate control modules, though they admitted they could not identify the exact source without disassembling significant portions of the engine, a process that carried its own substantial risk and would take additional weeks to complete safely. The Italian consultant arrived 2 days later, reviewed the German team's notes, disagreed with several of their conclusions, and proposed an entirely different theory involving a possible manufacturing defect in the wiring harness itself. He spent 3 days testing his theory before admitting, with visible frustration, that the wiring showed no signs of the defect he had expected to find. By the end of his visit, he told Charlotte privately that whoever built certain custom elements of this particular engine had clearly designed safeguards that were deliberately difficult to trace without intimate knowledge of the original architecture. It was a remark Charlotte initially dismissed as a polite excuse for failure, until the consultant added one more observation before leaving for the airport. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that whoever had first examined the vehicle, the person who had identified something serious enough to warrant a specialized diagnostic fee in the first place, had probably already understood exactly what was wrong before anyone else even opened the hood. Charlotte sat with that remark for a long time after he left, turning it over in her mind while staring at yet another invoice for failed consulting work that had cost considerably more than the number she had laughed at 1 week earlier. For the first time since the crisis began, she found herself questioning not the strange mechanic from the small garage, but Adrian, the man who had brought him in, dismissed him almost as quickly, and never once mentioned anything resembling a history between them. That night, she pulled up Hayes Automotive's internal personnel database, searching through old records with a growing, uncomfortable suspicion that something important had been deliberately left out of every conversation she'd had about this crisis so far. She did not yet know what she was looking for, but she had built a career on trusting her instincts, and her instincts were telling her, quietly but insistently, that someone inside her own company had been less than honest with her from the very beginning. The search took most of the night, but eventually Charlotte found what she had not realized she was looking for. Buried in an archived personnel file from a division merger that predated her own time as chief executive, she found Jackson Reed's name listed among a small team of original engineers credited with developing the prototype platform that eventually became the engine powering her company's flagship hypercar. The file was old, poorly scanned, and clearly had not been opened by anyone in years, but the information inside it was unmistakable. Jackson, she learned, had not simply contributed to the prototype team. He had held multiple patents related to cooling efficiency and sensor calibration, patents that Hayes Automotive still used in current production models without most employees ever realizing where the underlying architecture had originated. Industry forums she found through careful searching referred to him in respectful, almost reverent terms, the kind of language reserved for engineers whose work quietly shaped an entire category of vehicles long after they themselves had left the public spotlight. What disturbed her most was a separate document, a brief internal memo from years earlier, in which Adrian had formally recommended Jackson's removal from the engineering division following what the memo vaguely described as creative differences. Charlotte read the memo twice, then a third time, searching for any legitimate justification buried in its carefully neutral language, and finding none that explained why a man with Jackson's documented expertise had been pushed out rather than promoted. She confronted Adrian the following morning in his office, closing the door behind her with a deliberate quiet that unsettled him far more than shouting would have. She placed both documents on his desk without a word and watched his expression shift from confusion to recognition to something far more guarded as he realized exactly what she had found. His explanations came quickly, defensive and rehearsed-sounding, full of vague references to personality conflicts and outdated team dynamics that no longer applied. Charlotte did not raise her voice, though every instinct told her to. She simply asked him, directly, why he had brought a man with this exact history into a crisis involving the very engine that man had helped design, only to let him be humiliated and dismissed within minutes of arriving. Adrian had no good answer, only excuses that grew increasingly tangled the longer he tried to explain himself, each sentence revealing more about his own insecurity than he seemed to realize. By the time Charlotte left his office, she understood two things with complete clarity. The first was that Adrian had deliberately withheld information that could have saved the company enormous time, money, and public embarrassment. The second, more uncomfortable realization was that she herself had laughed a brilliant engineer out of her building without bothering to ask a single meaningful question about who he actually was, and that mistake belonged entirely to her, regardless of what Adrian had or had not told her beforehand. Charlotte drove to Jackson's garage alone, without an assistant trailing behind her, without a driver waiting outside, without the carefully managed entourage that usually surrounded every public appearance she made. She parked her own car on the gravel lot, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled, and stood for a moment outside the modest building before finally walking through the open bay door into a space that smelled of motor oil and old metal. Jackson was underneath a different vehicle when she arrived, a much older sedan belonging to some local customer who clearly could not afford the kind of attention Hayes Automotive's hypercar had received. He slid out from beneath the car at the sound of her footsteps, wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt, and regarded her with an expression that held no particular surprise, as though some part of him had expected this visit eventually. She told him everything, more honestly than she had spoken to anyone in days. She admitted the failed repairs, the expensive consultants who had found nothing useful, the mounting pressure from her board, and the personnel file she had discovered detailing exactly who he was and what he had built. She asked him, directly and without the polished diplomacy she usually relied on in business negotiations, to come back and finish what he had originally offered to do. Jackson listened without interrupting, the same patient quality in his expression that had unsettled her so much during their first meeting. When she finished speaking, he shook his head slowly and told her no, his voice calm but absolutely final. Charlotte blinked, genuinely caught off guard, certain that an apology combined with whatever fee he wanted would be enough to resolve the entire situation. She offered him double the original amount, then triple, watching his expression remain unchanged through each escalating figure until she finally asked him outright what it would actually take to convince him. Jackson set down the rag in his hands and looked at her steadily before answering. He told her this had never been about money, not from the very beginning, and that no amount she offered would change what had actually happened in that storage bay 1 week earlier. He explained, simply and without bitterness, that he had spent years building a quiet, respectable life after leaving an industry that once treated his expertise as disposable the moment it became inconvenient. Watching an entire room laugh at him for naming an honest price had reminded him exactly why he left in the first place, and no check, regardless of the number written on it, could undo the experience of being dismissed in front of strangers, simply because he did not look the way people expected an expert to look. Charlotte stood in silence for a long moment after he finished speaking, feeling something genuinely uncomfortable settle over her, an emotion she did not immediately recognize as shame because she so rarely allowed herself to feel it. She thanked him quietly for his time, turned, and walked back out to her car without another word, driving away with far more to think about than she had arrived with. Charlotte returned 3 days later, this time without any offer of money at all. She found Jackson outside his garage replacing a tire on his own truck, and she waited quietly until he finished before saying anything. When she finally spoke, the words came slower than before, less rehearsed, carrying none of the polished confidence she usually wielded so easily in front of cameras and shareholders. She apologized, plainly and specifically, for laughing at him, for allowing her managers to mock him without correction, and for failing to ask even one basic question about his background before dismissing him entirely. She told him she understood now that her mistake had nothing to do with the price he quoted and everything to do with how quickly she had decided he was not worth taking seriously, based on nothing more substantial than his appearance and his quiet manner. Jackson studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for the practiced sincerity executives often used when an apology served their own interests more than anyone else's. What he found instead seemed genuine enough that he finally nodded slowly and told her he would look at the car one more time, under conditions that were not open for negotiation. He wanted every member of the technical team present, including Adrian, with no exceptions and no excuses for absence. He wanted complete silence while he worked. No interruptions, no second-guessing, no quiet conversations happening behind his back while he tried to concentrate on a problem that had already proven dangerous to underestimate. Charlotte agreed to every condition without hesitation, relieved simply that he had agreed to return at all. Adrian, informed of the arrangement the following morning, felt something cold settle into his stomach that he recognized immediately as fear disguised as irritation. He understood with growing certainty exactly what Jackson was likely to find once he finally opened that engine bay with full attention and no distractions, and he understood precisely how badly that discovery would reflect on the technical decisions Adrian himself had personally approved months earlier during a routine software update. In a final desperate attempt to protect himself, Adrian quietly instructed a junior technician to alter a small section of diagnostic logs before Jackson's arrival, hoping to obscure the timeline connecting a specific firmware update to the very first appearance of the engine's cascading errors. The technician, uncomfortable with the request but unwilling to challenge his superior directly, mentioned it almost in passing to a colleague who happened to respect Jackson's old reputation far more than Adrian's current authority. Within hours, word of the altered logs reached Charlotte's office, and for the second time in 2 weeks, she found herself staring at evidence that Adrian had once again chosen self-preservation over honesty. The technical division gathered in the storage bay exactly as Jackson had requested, standing in a loose semicircle around the open engine compartment while Charlotte watched from a few steps back, arms crossed, unwilling to interfere but unable to look away. Adrian stood near the rear of the group, his expression carefully neutral, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed exactly how uncomfortable he felt standing so close to the very problem he had quietly tried to bury just days earlier. Jackson worked in near total silence, exactly as he had asked. He traced wiring paths with steady fingers, occasionally pausing to listen to something through a small handheld diagnostic tool he had brought from his own garage, equipment far more specialized than anything the in-house team had used during their earlier attempts. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared interrupt the methodical, almost meditative focus he maintained as he worked his way deeper into the engine's architecture. After nearly 15 minutes, he found it. A single custom sensor, rare enough that almost no general technician would recognize its specific function, had received a firmware update months earlier that conflicted directly with its original calibration. The update, Jackson explained quietly without looking up from his work, had been approved through standard procedures, and the approval signature on the record belonged to Adrian Cole personally. The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with Jackson's request for silence. Several engineers exchanged glances. Charlotte's gaze moved slowly toward Adrian, who had gone visibly pale, his earlier composure completely abandoned. Jackson did not look up to witness the reaction. He simply continued working, recalibrating the sensor by hand with tools precise enough to make adjustments measured in fractions most people would never notice. 2 more minutes passed in absolute silence. Then Jackson stepped back from the engine bay, wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his belt, and gave a small, simple nod toward the ignition switch. A nervous junior technician climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, his hand visibly shaking as he did so. The engine roared to life on the very first attempt, a deep, perfectly balanced sound that filled the entire storage bay and echoed off every concrete wall. It idled smoothly, without a single warning light, without a single error code interrupting the dashboard display that had spent more than a week cycling through endless, meaningless failures. Several engineers actually applauded without thinking, the sound rising spontaneously before anyone remembered to feel embarrassed about how long it had taken an outside expert to do what their entire division could not manage in over a week. Charlotte stood frozen for several long seconds, staring at the running engine with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet awe. 17 minutes. That was all it had taken Jackson Reed to solve a problem that had consumed her company's resources, reputation, and patience for more than a week. A problem that an entire division of highly paid engineers and internationally recruited specialists had failed entirely to understand. The internal investigation that followed moved quickly once Charlotte personally insisted on full transparency. Adrian's approval of the conflicting firmware update was confirmed within the diagnostic logs that had originally been altered, the falsified timeline easily reconstructed once investigators compared it against backup records the junior technician had quietly preserved before following Adrian's instructions. Within 2 weeks, Adrian was formally terminated, his departure handled with none of the quiet dignity he had once arranged for Jackson's own exit years earlier. The board, once informed of the complete situation, expressed less anger toward the technical failure itself and considerably more concern about how close the company had come to a public relations disaster entirely of its own making. Several members privately admitted relief that the truth had emerged before the international showcase rather than during it, a timeline that would have proven far more damaging to investor confidence and public perception alike. The press, predictably, shifted its tone almost overnight. The same outlets that had quietly speculated about a troubled, delayed unveiling now ran stories praising Hayes Automotive's commitment to uncovering internal accountability, framing the entire episode as proof of the company's integrity rather than evidence of its earlier dysfunction. Charlotte found the sudden reversal almost amusing, considering how little credit any of it had to do with her own initial judgment. When the dust finally settled, Charlotte offered Jackson a formal position within the company, a senior engineering role with a salary considerably larger than anything she had originally laughed off as unreasonable. Jackson declined politely but firmly, explaining that he had built his current life deliberately, away from boardrooms and corporate politics, and had no interest in trading his quiet garage for an office overlooking a parking structure. What he requested instead, when Charlotte pressed him to name a fair price for everything he had ultimately done, surprised everyone present in that final meeting. He asked only for the original amount he had quoted from the very beginning, $899. Nothing more, despite the company having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars failing to solve the very problem he resolved in under 20 minutes once given the chance. The room fell into stunned silence, several executives glancing at each other uncertain whether he was joking. Charlotte studied his face carefully, searching for some hidden negotiation tactic, some larger demand waiting beneath the surface of his apparent modesty. She found none. Jackson meant exactly what he said, and the simplicity of his request somehow carried far more weight in that boardroom than any larger sum ever could have. Charlotte asked him directly, once the room had emptied and they stood alone near the same storage bay where everything had started, why he had not simply asked for more. After everything the company had put him through, after every dollar wasted on consultants who failed where he succeeded, she genuinely wanted to understand why he had chosen restraint over what would have been, by any reasonable standard, a justified demand for far greater compensation. Jackson considered the question for a moment before answering, his tone thoughtful rather than rehearsed. He told her that people could always buy replacement parts. They could buy expensive cars, expensive consultants, even expensive apologies if they tried hard enough and had sufficient resources behind them. What nobody could ever purchase, he explained, was respect once it had already been thrown away in front of an entire room of witnesses, because money addressed consequences, not character. Charlotte said nothing for a long moment, turning his words over carefully, recognizing in them an honesty far more direct than anything she typically encountered in her professional life, where most conversations were carefully managed to avoid exactly this kind of uncomfortable truth. She had spent her entire career believing that sufficient resources could resolve almost any problem, any conflict, any mistake significant enough to threaten her company's reputation. Standing there, listening to a man in a worn work jacket explain something she had never properly considered before, she began to understand that her error from the very beginning had never really been about underestimating his skill. It had been about underestimating what dignity meant to someone who had already lost it once before, at the hands of people exactly like her. Before he left that day, Charlotte made him an offer entirely different from the position she had previously proposed. Not employment, not a title or an office, simply an open invitation to consult independently whenever the company faced problems that required his particular expertise, on his own terms, at his own pace, with full respect for the life he had deliberately built away from corporate hierarchies. Jackson considered it quietly, then finally agreed, extending his hand for the first genuine handshake either of them had offered the other since this entire situation began. 6 months later, Hayes Automotive announced a new flagship project, one developed with noticeably more humility and considerably more internal accountability than the company had previously practiced. Jackson worked alongside the engineering division as an independent consultant exactly as promised, appearing only when his expertise was genuinely needed, never staying longer than necessary, and never once raising his voice in any meeting he attended throughout the entire process. Charlotte's leadership style shifted in ways that surprised even her closest colleagues. She asked more questions before making judgments. She listened longer before forming opinions about people whose appearance or manner did not immediately match her expectations. The company, under this quieter, more deliberate version of her leadership, grew steadily stronger, posting better numbers and fewer public missteps than it had in the years before the crisis that started with a single laughed-off invoice. The hypercar that had once nearly destroyed the company's reputation eventually appeared at a major industry exhibition, polished and running flawlessly, drawing crowds eager to photograph the machine that had become an unlikely symbol of corporate transformation. Beside it sat a small, unassuming plaque that Charlotte had personally requested be installed, its message simple and direct for anyone willing to read it carefully. Never judge the value of an expert by the clothes he happens to be wearing. Charlotte stood near the display during the opening reception, watching visitors pause to read the plaque before turning their attention back to the gleaming machine beside it. She smiled quietly to herself, thinking of grease-stained jackets and gravel parking lots and a calm voice that had once promised, without anger or exaggeration, that a car would never move again. Jackson, true to form, did not stay for the reception. He slipped away from the exhibition floor before most attendees even realized he had been present at all, disappearing into the evening crowd while applause for the unveiling rose steadily behind him, content to let the machine speak for itself, exactly as he always had. If you enjoy watching pure arrogance crumble into humility, stay until the end because the biggest twist is still coming.